online. We're glad that you're watching. I want to thank you guys out at the detention center who watch us on Tuesday nights. I also want to thank the folks down at Westview in Clinton County, and I also understand we have a small group at Golden Years Nursing Home that's watching. So we want to thank them for tuning in. You might have seen a rose over here. This is to represent the birth of Derek and Jessica Phillips' son, who was born earlier this week, Amos Dean Phillips. I told the folks in the first service, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, then you know there's going to be quite a competition to see who plays Baby Jesus in the Christmas play. So we might even have to have some tryouts this year. So just be prepared for that. Also, we have a special guest with us today, if I can find them. There they are, right there behind William Allen. Austin and Ashley Gregory have baby Everly here, who just got out of UK hospital on Thursday. Is that right? So I know you've been praying for them. Let's welcome them. If you wake her up, I'll put her back to sleep. So don't worry about anything like that. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to John chapter 5. In 2019, you and I live in a world that's become increasingly obsessed with the idea of self-improvement. In many ways, that's a good thing, but just like anything else, you can take it a little bit too far. Last year, the New Yorker ran an article with this headline, "Improving Ourselves to Death." And in the article, they talked about how many of us have bought in this idea of using technology to try and improve our lives. I want you to look at this quote from the article. Here's what they said. "It's no longer enough to imagine our way to a better state of body or mind. We must now chart our progress, count our steps, log our sleep rhythms, tweak our diets, record our negative thoughts, then analyze the data, recalibrate," and whatever that last word was, repeat. Now, if you've tried doing this, you know this is not easy. It's not easy to improve yourself. That's why so many people look for shortcuts. Now, I have a picture I want to show you. There was a court case from November of last year that featured this man. This is Emil Ratelband. He's from the Netherlands. He was born on March the 11th, 1949 in the Netherlands, making him 69 years old. But in the fall of last year, Mr. Ratelband filed a lawsuit that would have legally changed his birthday from March the 11th, 1949 to March the 11th, 1969, making him 49 years old instead of 69 years old. Now, when he was asked about the reasons behind his desire to change his birthday, he said that he discovered that being 69 years old was having a negative effect on his life. In particular, he said it greatly limited his employment opportunities, and it greatly reduced his chances of finding a date on these various dating apps of which he was a member. According to him, his doctors have told him that he has the body of a person in their mid-40s. So his question was, if he has that kind of body, why should he identify as being 69 years old? Here's what he told USA Today. He said, "When I'm on a dating app and it says I'm 69, I don't get an answer. But when I'm 49, with the face that I have, I'll be in a luxurious position." I don't know, man. I like this guy's confidence. A luxurious position. Some of you are wondering right now what time the courthouse opens tomorrow, because you're going to go file your own petition. Now, unfortunately for Mr. Ratelband, the court denied his claim. Here's what they said. "Mr. Ratelband is at liberty to feel 20 years younger than his real age and act accordingly. But amending his date of birth would cause 20 years of records to vanish from the register of births, deaths, and marriages and registered partnerships. This would have a variety of undesirable legal and societal implications." Then they ended with this line. "Free will does not extend so far as to make every desired outcome legally possible." Now, at the conclusion of the hearing, his lawyers promised to appeal the outcome, but as far as I could tell, they haven't filed anything yet. So I was thinking about this, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool, like, if that's how it really worked? Wouldn't it be cool if you could change your life just by, filling out a form and signing it? So, I might be, 4 foot 6 inches tall right now, but I really want to be 6 foot 4 inches tall, so I'm going to go to the courthouse, I'm going to change it, and I'm going to have a judge sign off on it. Or instead of, having an empty bank account, I want my bank account to be full. So I'm going to go see if the judge maybe will count the $200 that I currently have as $2 million, and that will solve all of my problems. I mean, wouldn't it be awesome if that's how it really worked? What would you change about yourself? Maybe your height, your weight, your net worth, your IQ, your family, your appearance. Now, I don't know what it is for you, but I know there are certain things that all of us wish that we could change that are essentially unchangeable. They're just like your birthday. You can't do much to change it. And sometimes as we get older, what happens is we tend to learn to accept those things. We might not like them, but at least we learn to accept them because they're unchangeable. There are other things, though, that deep down inside we know are changeable that for whatever reason we don't change. Or sometimes you fall into the trap of confusing what's changeable and what's unchangeable. There are some things that are completely changeable that we convince ourselves are unchangeable. And whenever you do that, you put yourself in a position where it's almost impossible to make any real progress. If you have your Bible with you, open to John chapter 5. We're going to look this morning at the story of a man who found himself in what to him seemed like an unchangeable position. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Gospel of John, it was written by a guy named John, the Apostle John, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples, and as best we can tell, John was the last man standing. He outlived all the other disciples by a pretty wide margin, and then when he got to be an old man, he was reflecting on his life, he was thinking back to some of these incredible experiences that he had with Jesus, and he sat down to write his story with Jesus. He documents some of the things that he saw firsthand. And near the end of the gospel, he tells us why he went to the trouble of writing these things down. Here's what he says in John chapter 20. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Every book you've ever read was written for a purpose. Every author has an intended message, some sort of agenda for what they write that they want you to pick up on. John makes it clear to us that when you look at his gospel, everything leading up to this, every verse, every story, every passage was put there to help you believe that Jesus was exactly who he said he was. That's especially true at the story we're going to look at in John chapter 5. Now, as chapter 5 opens, Jesus is now about 16 months into his 3-year ministry. At this point, he's been performing some miracles. He's been saying a lot of interesting things, so he's starting to get some attention, and people everywhere he goes are gathered around him to see what he's going to do next. As our story begins, Jesus and his entourage, his disciples, have just entered the city of Jerusalem after traveling through the region known as Galilee. When they arrive in Jerusalem, one of the first places they go is a well-known public pool. I want you to check out how John tells this story. John chapter 5, verse 1. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. Now, a picture that I want to show you. This is a picture of what's left of the Pool of Bethesda. It was discovered in the late 19th century, and since then, archaeologists have been busy trying to uncover and learn as much as they could about this well-known place. In Jesus' day, this was a place where people with all sorts of physical problems would gather on a daily basis. Now, that being said, it was also a place where most healthy people worked hard to avoid it. Everywhere you looked, on these 5 covered porches, there'd be people lying there with bodies just ravaged by disease. And the sights and the smells and the sounds of this place would be enough to turn anybody's stomach. Everywhere you looked, it was just one broken person after another. And the reason the people gathered there is because at this Pool of Bethesda, there was this ancient legend that had developed over the centuries. Now, if you have a paper copy of the Bible, you'll notice that verse 4 is missing. It skips from verse 3 to verse 5, and verse 4 is included at the bottom of the page. The reason that's true, in the earliest manuscripts that we found, there is no verse 4. Somebody went back and added that later to explain why these people were there. And over time, what had happened is these people believed that from time to time, at these periodic increments, that an invisible angel from heaven would come down and stir that water. And the idea is if you were the first person to enter the pool after that water had been stirred by this angel, that you would be healed. So you'd be sitting there, and the water would be calm, and then for no apparent reason, the water would start to move and sort of bubble up. Now, what archaeologists have discovered since then is that underneath this pool was an intermittent spring. So that spring would shoot up, and that water would bubble up, and people thought it was an angel. It's easy for us to sort of look down at that, but when you're sick and you're desperate, you'll believe just about anything. But when you get to verse 5, you're introduced to a man who's in a desperate situation. Here's what John says. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. Make sure you let that sink in. 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" Now here's this guy. We don't know what his issue is, but we know for 38 long years, his life has not been what he hoped it would be. For 38 years, he's been lying there. The NIV calls him an invalid. We don't know what his issue was. Maybe it was multiple sclerosis, maybe some sort of cancer, tuberculosis, heart disease. I mean, it could have been anything. But whatever it was, it robbed this guy of his ability to live a normal life. And so every day he gets up and somebody takes him to this pool. They drop him off, and every day he sits there all day long hoping that today will be the day that his situation changes. And every day, for a long, long time, he goes home disappointed. That's why it's so interesting. It's strange to us when Jesus first encounters him, his question is, do you want to get well? And I read that and I think, well, Jesus, that's kind of a dumb question. Of course the guy wants to get well. 38 years, he's been an invalid. He's been laying there for year after year, nobody to help him. I mean, he's fighting for his life. Of course he wants to get well. But then when you think about it a little deeper and you pause to really study the question, you discover that maybe Jesus was on to something. See, the truth is there are some things that are unchangeable. But then there are other things that are very changeable that we refuse to change. You've got them in your life and I've got them in mine. There's an old saying that I use with our leaders a lot that says, nobody likes the way things are, and nobody likes change. And what happens so often is that even though we may not like the way things are, we think that dealing with things the way they are is easier than changing, so we just sort of get used to the way things are. You've experienced that, and I have too. Now, maybe you're not an invalid like the guy in this story, but there are other things in your life that you would like to change that you could change. Maybe it's your health, your finances, your marriage, your relationship with your kids, or any number of things. And deep down inside, you know there are certain steps that you could take to improve your life in those areas, but you don't take them. For a lot of people, there's a lot of things we could change. So when Jesus comes along and he asks the question, hey, do you want to get well? I think he's asking a serious question because not everybody does. There's some people who made the decision that even though it's hard, that staying sick would be easier than getting well. So they don't change. I asked Dr. Mayer, who's a surgeon here in town, I said, what percentage of the people that come to you for surgery do you think actually want to get well? He thought about it for a few days, and then he shared with me that for the people who go through all the doctor's visits and the pre-op process, and they show up for the surgery, the number would be around 80%. Now that sounds pretty good, but then you start to think about the people who somewhere along the line sort of drop out of the process. So they don't go to the doctor in the first place, or they don't want to go through the therapy, or they don't want to go through the recovery, so they just choose to stay in pain rather than face surgery. Then I thought to myself, I wonder if it's different for people who have problems other than physical problems. So I have a friend that's a full-time counselor, and I texted him this question. I said, what percentage of people who go to counseling do you think actually want to get better? And he said there's actually been research done on this, and the number of people who desire to get well is somewhere around 20%. Think about that. The rest of them are there for a different reason. Maybe it was court-ordered. Maybe they just want a prescription. Maybe they want to get a check, or they want their spouse to get off their case, or some other reason. So according to him, if you were to ask most people, do you want to get well, the answer would be no. there's some things that are changeable that we don't change. So how about you? How would you answer that question? If Jesus came to you and he said, hey, do you want to get well? What would your answer be? And if the answer is yes, then how do you do that? One of the things I love about this story is you read through this, before you get to the right answer, Jesus takes some time and he shows us some things that don't work. I call them dead-end roads. These are things that people sometimes do or paths that people sometimes follow in hopes of getting well that never works. If you're keeping track on your outline in the bulletin or on the app, here's the first one. It's superstition. Now, we read this story in 2019. It's easy for us to kind of look down on these people and we think, well, how could anybody think, this pool was filled with magic water that could heal a person? And in our world, when we think of somebody suffering, we think in terms of doctor's visits and MRIs and hospital stays and all that. We don't normally think in terms of visible angels, coming down from heaven. But you have to remember that in that time period, there weren't many doctors, and even the doctors that were around were not well trained. So I did a little research this week, and I found a couple of examples of common medical beliefs from this time period that people believe. Now, as I go through this, you might want to write these down just in case. Here's the first one. If you want to keep your hair from turning gray, here's what you have to do. To prevent hair from turning gray, anoint it with the blood of a black calf, boiled in oil with the fat of a rattlesnake. Did you get that? If you want to keep your hair from turning gray, that's your answer. Here's another one. When hair falls out, apply a mixture of 6 fats, those of the horse, the hippo, the crocodile, the cat, the snake, and the ibex. To strengthen it, anoint it with the tooth of a donkey crushed in honey. That'll keep your hair from falling. Now, just in case you're wondering, I do have printed copies of these that I can give to you if you're worried about it. I'll be honest, I didn't know what an ibex was. And I had to look that up, and unfortunately, you can't find them around here, so you might have to find a substitute. But it's easy for us to sort of sit back and, look down on that and kind of laugh at that, but the truth is, we do the same stuff. And you've seen an example of this, 4-leaf clovers, rabbit's foots, lucky pennies, Friday the 13th, broken mirrors, opening an umbrella inside, tossing salt over your shoulder, a black cat, crossing your path. Even in the church world, we do the same type of stuff. If you pay attention, you'll see examples of this. Magic crosses, miracle water from the river of Jordan, some prayer cloth that's been prayed over by some TV preacher that he'll send to you if you send him $99. These ancient icons, and according to the Bible, all that stuff is worthless. None of that stuff has any power to have any effect on your life or improve your situation. Here's the second dead-end road. Dead-end religion. Dead religion. One of the things that's interesting about this story is how close the Pool of Bethesda was to the temple. Now, in Jerusalem, in the Jewish religious system, the temple was the focal point of everything. And yet, right within shouting distance of the temple was this Pool of Bethesda. So every day at the temple, you had thousands of people who would go to the temple, hundreds of leaders, and they would go there, and they'd offer their sacrifices, and they'd recite their verses, and they'd listen to lectures about relating to God. And yet, just literally a few yards away, within just shouting distance, were all these people who were broken and hurting, and they were right there next to the most religious place on the earth, and it had no effect on their situation. Same thing can happen to us. You can go to church, you can sing all the songs, you can give your offering, you can listen to all the messages, but if all you're doing is going through the motions, if you're only coming because you're going to feel guilty, if you don't come or because you don't want to disappoint your grandma when she asks you later if you went to church, if that's the only reason you're coming, it's not going to change much for you. It's not going to improve your situation. Here's a third thing, the status quo. Here's a guy, John tells us, he's been in this condition for 38 years. Now, no matter how you look at it, 38 years is a long time. And this guy could have decided that since he'd already been like this for 38 years, that this was just what his story was going to look like. A lot of people make that decision. Maybe you've been one of them. And every once in a while, you'll hear people even verbalize this. They'll say things like, well, I know it's not perfect, but it's just the way things are. I know it's not the best way, but this is the way I've always done it. I'd like for things to be different, but I'm too old to change now. And I don't know what it is, but there are a lot of people who make this conscious decision just to maintain the status quo even when they know there's a better path out there. For whatever reason, they choose to stay sick rather than working to get well. Here's a fourth thing, self-reliance. How many people do you know who have spent their lives trying to improve their lives and proven to themselves they're incapable of doing it? I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some issues in your life that you can improve on. If you have a problem with your money, there's classes you can take. If you want to get in better shape, there's programs that you can follow. There's a lot of people who spend the majority of their lives trying to create this perfect version of themselves, but the problem is they keep running into themselves. And they realize there's one issue that they can't solve, and it's the most important issue. It's their sin issue. And the only thing that you can do to solve that issue is to follow the person that has the ability to solve it, and it's not you, it's Jesus. See, the guy in this story was in a similar situation. There was nothing he could do to save himself. There was nothing he could do to heal himself. The only hope he had was that someone would come along and would do for him what he could never do for himself. Now here's the last problem, the dead-end road of excuses. In verse 6, Jesus asked this guy a question, do you want to get well? But then I want you to look at his response to Jesus' question in verse 7. Here's what it says. Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Now, I don't want to be too hard on this guy. I mean, 38 years, a long time. He's been suffering. But if you look closely at his response, he doesn't really answer the question that Jesus asked him. Jesus asked him if he wanted to get well. The man responds by telling Jesus why he can't get well. And he's using his physical situation as an excuse. Now, have you ever noticed, like, when people around you make excuses, it kind of makes you mad? They say, well, I can't do this, and I can't do that. There's no hope for this. And I mean, people around me do that sometimes. I get mad, but then you know what I'll do? I'll turn around and make my own excuses. I mean, all of us are experts at making excuses. And yet, deep down inside, we all know that excuses never lead to comebacks. In fact, excuses prevent comebacks. So you have to be careful. So here are all these dead-end roads, different things that people try, man, they're going to improve their situation, and none of it works. And that's why so many people go through life, and they're so frustrated because they tried this and it didn't work. So they switched over to this, and that didn't work either. So they went back to this, and that didn't work. And they think if they just try harder, and they keep trying hard, and nothing changes because you can't solve your own problems. So what do? How do you experience a comeback? Check out verse 8. Then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. This is so awesome. It's hard to even wrap your mind. Here's this guy. He's been laying there for almost 4 decades. And during that time, his body has literally wasted away. There's no muscle memory. There's no, reserves of strength to draw from. Of all things, this traveling rabbi comes along. He's been laying there his whole life, almost his whole life, and he says to him, hey, I want you to do something that from all appearances would be impossible for you to do. But then the strangest thing happens. This guy does something he had not been able to do in 38 years. He picks up his mat and he walks. Now, if you were to go back and read the New Testament, one of the things you'll discover is that oftentimes whenever Jesus heals somebody, there's something that he asks them to do. There's some action, there's some step that he tells them to take. So he heals a leper, and he tells the leper to go and show himself to the priest. He comes upon these guys who are fishermen, and they're not catching anything, so he tells them to cast their net on the other side of the lake. In John chapter 9, there's this blind guy. He gives him his sight, and he immediately tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. There's always some step or some action that he wants a person to take. So if you're keeping track on your outline, here's the first part of this to the solution. You take a step. For the man in this story, the first step was to stand and pick up his mat. That was a symbol to the man that there was not going to be any going back. He wasn't going to leave his mat there, in case it didn't work out. He could always come back tomorrow. Now, he was going in a brand new direction, a brand new life, but in order to confirm it in the man's own mind, he first had to take this step of faith. You may have heard this phrase, you're always one step away from a much better life. That's what happened to this guy. And I think that's true for most of us. I think most of us here are literally one decision away from experiencing a totally different and much better life. And I don't know what the step is for you, but my suspicion is you probably know. Maybe it's going to counseling. Maybe it's joining an addiction recovery group. Maybe it's quitting your job or finding a new job or going back to school or having a hard conversation with somebody who's hurt you or you apologizing to somebody that you've hurt. And I don't know what it is for you, but I know for most people, in order to truly get well, you first have to take a step. Not 100 steps, not 1,000 steps, but a step. For some of you here this morning, some of you watching, the first step that you need to take is become a follower of Jesus. Some of you listen right now, and you can identify with this story because in many ways it's your story. You may not be an invalid, but you're in a situation where your life is not what you hoped it would be, not what you expected it would be, and you've tried all kinds of things in order to make it better, but it's not getting any better. And you're not sure what to do next. Can I just tell you, until you become a follower of Jesus, it's not going to get any better. I can promise you that. That's why the first step for you today needs to be to make sure that you have that relationship with Jesus. If that means coming down and praying with David and I at the end of the service, that's great. Some of us will be in the lobby. You can grab one of us. Maybe it's just a process that you need to work through with somebody. Maybe it's just rekindling the passion that you once had. I mean, maybe you used to be on fire in your relationship with Jesus and then you got distracted or you drifted or whatever. But the thing is, if you'll just take that one step that God's calling you to take, whatever it is, He'll take the rest of the steps towards you. You don't have to keep going forever. You just take a step towards Him, and then He comes and He meets you there. And He'll take you where you can never get on your own. Here's the second thing. You take a step towards Jesus, and then you continue to trust Jesus. This passage represents a turning point in the story of Jesus. So I want you to check this out. The second part of verse 9. Here's what it says. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who'd been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. So because this took place right there in the heart of Jerusalem, it didn't take long for the Jewish religious leaders to figure out that Jesus had healed this guy and instructed him to carry his mat on the Sabbath, which they counted as a violation of the law against working on the Sabbath. Now, by this point in history, the Jewish religious hierarchy had developed 39 different categories of things you weren't supposed to do. And within each of those categories were hundreds and hundreds of specific examples of things that they didn't think you were supposed to do in order to obey God's law. The problem was that most of what they came up with were man-made. It was their own additions to what God had already said. So here are these religious guys, and they're literally being harder on people than God was. And they come and they're upset, so they find out this man's been healed on the Sabbath, and rather than celebrating with him, they want to come down on him for breaking one of their man-made rules. So they bring him in, they begin to interrogate him, but here's what I want you to catch. Rather than trying to explain himself, here's what this guy does. They've been there, he's been there all these years, all these guys have ignored him for year after year after year. Now when they want to come down on him, he says, "Hey, I'm just doing what that guy told me to do." And he points to Jesus. He's been suffering all these years with no interest, and he's not going to fall into their trap now. But what comes next, my favorite part of the story, this man that's been healed goes to the temple, and he runs into Jesus. Check out verse 14. Later, Jesus found him at the temple, and he said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." the man went away and told the Jewish religious leaders that it was Jesus who'd made him well. There's a lot of confusion about what Jesus meant when he told this guy to stop sinning. But what I want you to pay attention to is the last part of the story. This guy, he sees Jesus at the temple. They have this moment where they communicate with each other, and immediately, what's this guy do? He goes back to those same religious leaders that had been giving him a hard time, and he tells them that it was Jesus who did all this. Now, here's the point. There are some comebacks that are so dramatic that the only way they can be explained is by pointing to Jesus. Only Jesus could take a guy who'd been an invalid for 38 years and give him the ability to walk. Only Jesus could take a person whose life is a complete train wreck and rebuild it into something beautiful. Only Jesus can take an addict and help them get clean. Only Jesus can take a family that's been shattered into pieces and rebuild them into a model of love and commitment. Only Jesus can take a self-centered and selfish person and transform them into the model of selfless love. Only Jesus can do those things. This man's life was changed because he trusted Jesus enough to take a step towards Jesus. Now, here's my question. Do you trust Jesus enough to take a step towards Jesus? Not 100 steps, not 1,000 steps, just one step. The Greek word that gets translated as Bethesda here means house of mercy or flowing water. That's why where this pool, where all this took place, was called the Pool of Bethesda. And as I said, it was believed that if you could just get in that pool, that you would experience the mercy of God and that God would heal you. So I was thinking about this story this week, and it occurred to me that even though at this pool, John tells us that it's a popular hangout for people with physical issues. And everywhere you look, 5 covered colonnades, there'd just be these bodies lined up, everybody there. And as best we can tell, Jesus only healed one of those people. Now, I don't know why he didn't heal everybody, but the implication is that he healed this guy, and then the rest of those people stayed there, probably for the rest of their lives, waiting for a moment that never came. Now, I want you to imagine how frustrating it would be to be that close to something that you thought might be able to change your life. I mean, to be that close day after day and never be able to experience it. That would be the most frustrating thing I could imagine. But then I want you to imagine how foolish it would be to be that close to something that you knew could change your life and yet refusing to experience it. So here's the thing. All of us have been invited to experience the grace and the mercy of God anytime we want it. We've got an open invitation. You don't have to wait for an invisible angel to come down and stir the water. You don't have to wait for a lightning bolt or a sign in the cloud. You don't have to fill out any forms and file them at the courthouse. You don't have to answer a bunch of questions from a bunch of religious people. All you have to do is accept his invitation. But here's the problem. For many of us, the thing that holds us back and keeps us from experiencing this is us. In Ephesians 5:14, Paul says it like this: "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Now, there are a lot of things about your life that you think are unchangeable. And there's a lot of things that you may have convinced yourself are unchangeable. But I want you to know that no matter how bad your situation may be, every setback is a setup for a comeback. And it very well could be that right now, the thing that's keeping you from experiencing a fresh start is that one step. And I don't know what it is for you, but my suspicion is you know. And if you don't know, I want you to pray that God would make it clear. I want you to stand. We're going to have a brief invitation. And as we sing together, there's one question I want you to think about, and it's this. Ask yourself, do I want to get well? Because if you do, there's a path forward. If you do, if you really want to get better, if you want to get well, Jesus will meet you and he'll take you where he wants you to go. But he won't force you. So if you're here and you need to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, you just meet us on this front row. Dave and I will be here.